Our sufferings were now drawing to a close. A terrible death appeared shortly to await us. Hunger became violent and outrageous, and we prepared for a speedy release from our troubles. Our speech and reason were both considerably impaired, and we were reduced to be at this time certainly the most helpless and wretched of the whole human race. Isaac Cole, one of our crew, had the day before this, in a fit of despair, thrown himself down in the boat and was determined there calmly to wait for death. It was obvious that he had no chance. All was dark, he said, in his mind. Not a single ray of hope was left for him to dwell upon. And it was folly and madness to be struggling against what appeared so palpably to be our fixed and settled destiny. I remonstrated with him as effectually as the weakness both of my body and understanding would allow of, and what I said appeared for a moment to have a considerable effect. He made a powerful and sudden effort, half rose up, crawled forward and hoisted the jib, and firmly and loudly cried that he would not give up, that he would live as long as the rest of us. But alas, this effort was but the hectic fever of the moment, and he shortly again relapsed into a state of melancholy and despair. This day his reason was attacked, and he became about 9 o'clock in the morning a most miserable spectacle of madness. He spoke incoherently about everything, calling loudly for a napkin and water, and then lying stupidly and senselessly down in the boat again, would close his hollow eyes as if in death. About 10 o'clock we suddenly perceived that he became speechless. We got him as well as we were able upon a board, placed on one of the seats of the boat, and covering him up with some old clothes, we left him to his fate. He lay in the greatest pain and apparent misery, groaning piteously until 4 o'clock, when he died, in the most horrid and frightful convulsions I ever witnessed. We kept his corpse all night, and in the morning my 2 companions began, as of course, to make preparations to dispose of it in the sea. When after reflecting on the subject all night, I addressed them on the painful subject of keeping the body for food. Our provisions could not possibly last us beyond 3 days, within which time it was not in any degree probable that we should find relief from our present sufferings, and that hunger would at last drive us to the necessity of casting lots. It was without any objection agreed to, and we set to work as fast as we were able to prepare it, so as to prevent it spoiling. The preceding passage describes February 8, 1821, taken from the memoirs of Owen Chase, first mate of the whaleship Essex. Its crew had been drifting for over 2 months in the South Pacific in 3 small whaleboats, after a large sperm whale rammed their ship in 2 furious attacks, stoving in her bow and sinking her. Some of its 20 crewmen would survive the agonizing ordeal, but only by resorting to the custom of the sea. The Whaleship Essex, today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, Tales of Mishaps, Misfortune, and Misadventure. I'm your host, Rich Napolitano. In episode 96, Captain's Dinner, you heard the story of the yacht Mignonette and the struggle for survival of its 4 occupants. Ultimately, the cabin boy Richard Parker was sacrificed, and the other 3 men resorted to cannibalism. Their actions resulted in one of the most influential legal cases in maritime history, and the custom of the sea became classified as murder. The history of cannibalism at sea dates back as far as humans have been venturing out on the water. Mariners over the ages have become stranded at sea and have been forced to put their very humanity to the test. One of the most infamous examples of this was the American whaleship Essex, which provided the inspiration, at least in part, for Herman Melville's classic novel, Moby Dick. In 1819, the whaling fleet of Nantucket had finally recovered after being virtually wiped out during the War of 1812. The hardened sailors and seasoned captains of the fleet were renowned for their expertise and tenacity in collecting the oil that powered the world. The practice of hunting whales is now generally considered barbaric and irresponsible to most of the world, but in the early 19th century, whale populations were considered endless, and their oil was a means of survival for many. The Essex was a rather unremarkable ship, a fully rigged 88-foot whaler launched in 1799. At 239 tons, she was a bit small for a whaler, although she carried 5 28-foot whaleboats and had been quite successful in its prior voyages. On August 12, 1819, the Essex set sail with a crew of 21, with 36-year-old Captain George Pollard Jr. in command. Pollard had been with the Essex for 5 years, serving 2 years as second mate and 3 as first mate before becoming its captain. Pollard's first mate was recently promoted 23-year-old Owen Chase of Nantucket, and second mate, 26-year-old Matthew Joy, was also a Nantucket man. The remaining crew were a diverse mix of men, including Nantucketers, 2 Cape Codders, 1 Portuguese, and an Englishman. Included among the crew were 6 black men, 1 from New York, and 5 whose birthplaces are unknown. Whaling was a young man's industry, as the work was physically demanding and required long stretches of time away from home. 6 of the crew were under 20 years old, with cabin boy Thomas Nickerson being the youngest, at only 14 years old. Neither race, age, nationality, class, status, or anything else mattered on a whaleboat, only doing your job. Along with 14 other whale ships from Nantucket, the Essex was bound for the whale hunting grounds in the Pacific. New England whalers were accustomed to rounding Cape Horn in pursuit of their prize. In this case, it was the highly sought-after oil from sperm whales, whose oil burned clean and was used for the world's gas lamps and to lubricate machinery that was powering the Industrial Revolution. The Essex departed Nantucket on August 12, 1819, and within just days sailed into a strong gale while passing through the Gulf Stream. The intense waves pushed the ship over on its beam and almost sank her. 2 of her whaleboats were smashed to bits, and its top gallant sail was lost. Pollard wished to return to Nantucket for repairs, but Chase and Joy convinced him to sail on to the Azores for repairs, and an additional whaleboat was purchased at Cape Verde. In January of 1820, the Essex finally managed to round Cape Horn after battling the fierce gales and monstrous waves for 5 weeks. Once in the Pacific, the Essex met up with several other whaleboats near St. Mary's Island off the coast of Chile. The Essex spent 5 months hunting these waters, and while they had limited success finding whales, Pollard found the hunting grounds to be largely depleted. In May, Pollard took the Essex north to Peru and found better success. While he had already filled over 400 barrels with whale oil, there was still time to find even more. Pollard met up with another Nantucket whaler, the Aurora, and its captain informed him of a newly discovered hunting ground about 2,000 miles offshore from Peru. After spending a bit more time hunting inshore, the Essex made a few stops for provisioning, including at Atacamas, now a city in Ecuador. It was here that Pollard lost a crew member when Henry DeWitt jumped ship and disappeared. This left the Essex short-handed, especially when the whaleboats were launched to pursue their prey. In early October of 1820, the Essex made a stop at Charles Island, now named Española Island, of the Galapagos Islands to repair a significant leak. The Essex then moved on to Floriana Island, then called Hood Island, where over 300 Galapagos tortoises were captured to replenish their food stores. While out hunting for tortoises, boat steerer Thomas Chappell started a small fire, meant to be a prank. He believed it would be a bit of a scare for his shipmates while they were out hunting. But it was the dry season, and the underbrush quickly burned out of control and spread to the entire island. The men were cut off from their only escape route back to the ship, and were forced to run through the flames. Captain Pollard was absolutely furious at the carelessness and irresponsibility. Cabin boy Thomas Nickerson wrote in his diary, "The captain's wrath knew no bounds, swearing vengeance upon the head of the incendiary should he be discovered." Fearing a terrible punishment from his captain and shipmates, Chappell kept his misdeed a secret. The following day, the flaming island could still be seen in the distance. The entire island was ablaze, killing all plant life and all wildlife. Nickerson described their departure was, quote, backlit by the red glow of a dying island. Nickerson returned to the island many years later and wrote, "Neither trees, shrubbery, nor grass have since appeared." Charles Darwin would not make his historic visit to the Galapagos in HMS Beagle until 1835. When he arrived at Floriana Island, he found the charred, black landscape of a deserted island. He observed the return of some flora and fauna, but the Floriana tortoise and Floriana mockingbird had become extinct. Despite the unfortunate incident, the Essex continued on its mission, sailing west toward the offshore hunting grounds. They reached the target area in November and began their search. In the morning hours of November 20th, a lookout observed whales spouting in the distance and cried out, "There she blows!" The 3 available whaleboats were immediately launched, with their crews armed with harpoons and their other tools of the trade. The boats were commanded by Captain Pollard, First Mate Owen Chase, and Second Mate Matthew Joy, respectively. Chase made the first attack, striking a sperm whale with a harpoon. But the tail of the giant mammal whipped around and smashed his boat, causing a seam in its planks to open up. As water gushed in, Chase was forced to cut the harpoon line and return to the ship to make repairs. Pollard and Joy also landed their harpoons. As the whales fought for their survival, they dragged the whaleboats away from the Essex. Chase and his crew of 5 men arrived back at the Essex and hauled their boat up to begin repairs. Just then, Chase noticed a large bull sperm whale. "I observed a very large spermaceti whale, as well as I could judge, about 85 feet in length," wrote Chase. "He spouted 2 or 3 times and then disappeared. In less than 2 or 3 seconds he came up again, about the length of the ship off, and made directly for us, at the rate of about 3 knots. I involuntarily ordered the boy at the helm to put it hard up, intending to sheer off and avoid him. The order was scarcely out of my mouth before he came down upon us with full speed and struck the ship with his head." The head of a sperm whale is elongated and squared off at its front. A large male like this one would have a head about 20 feet long and represent 1/3 of the whale's total mass. Propelled at full speed, it was an enormous battering ram. The massive blow caused the ship to heel over and rock from side to side. The crew was stunned by what had just happened. Chase described, "We looked at each other with perfect amazement, deprived almost of the power of speech. After a few moments' reflection and recovering, I of course concluded that he had stove a hole in the ship, and that it would be necessary to set the pumps going. They had not been in operation for more than 1 minute, before I perceived the head of the ship to be gradually settling down in the water. Suddenly another shout was heard. 'Here he is making for us again.' I turned around and saw him about 100 rods directly ahead of us, coming down with twice his ordinary speed, and it appeared with tenfold fury and vengeance in his aspect. The surf flew in all directions about him with the continual violent thrashing of his tail, his head about half out of the water, and in that way he came upon us and again struck the ship. The impact of the whale's massive head hit the bow of the ship with such incredible force that it smashed through the bow. Chase and the others were stunned, but quickly they gathered what supplies they could, and the 8 men boarded the one remaining whaleboat. They watched in horror as the remnants of their broken ship, their former home, heeled over on its side and floated at the surface like a dying whale. They sat in quiet despair until the remaining crew returned in their whaleboats. As Captain Pollard's boat approached, one man cried out, "Oh my God, where is the ship?" Captain Pollard stood up, observing the men in the single whaleboat, and the Essex lying lame and sinking beyond, with its masts buried under the waves. He shouted, "My God, Mr. Chase, what is the matter?" Chase answered, "We have been stove in by a whale." The men of the Essex were stranded in one of the most isolated areas of the Pacific Ocean. Chase was able to calculate their location to be 0 degrees 40 minutes south latitude and 119 degrees west longitude. Peru was 2,400 miles due east, but strong westward currents were too powerful to attempt that route. A voyage to the southeast toward Chile would pit them against southeasterly trade winds and the strong Peruvian current. To the south were only a few tiny specks of land, uninhabited islands that would be almost impossible to find. Beyond that was only the inhospitable ice of Antarctica. The Marquesas Islands were 1,500 miles to the southwest, with favorable trade winds and currents making them entirely feasible to reach. However, Captain Pollard and crew mistakenly believed the Marquesas to be occupied by cannibals. Pollard suggested the Society Islands instead, but Chase and Joy believed cannibals were a threat there as well. Captain Pollard later remarked, "We feared that we should be devoured by cannibals if we cast ourselves on their mercy." They were unaware that the Marquesas Islands had been claimed by the United States in 1813, and its people were friendly to outsiders. Instead, Pollard determined the only available option was to head due south to 25 degrees latitude, then take advantage of the easterly trade winds that blowed toward Chile. It was 1,900 miles alone to reach 25 degrees south, and another 2,200 miles east to Chile. This was 500 miles farther than Captain Bligh had miraculously accomplished in a small launch after the mutiny on the Bounty in 1789. This would be a monumental voyage given their circumstances. Their small whaleboats were agile and suited for their purpose, but were crudely built and fragile. They often were damaged during the process of whaling, so they were constructed for easy repairs using inexpensive materials. They were built with half-inch overlapping cedar planks, or clinker style, and very prone to leaking. Much more dire was their lack of provisions, with 20 men to feed during their 4,100-mile journey. The morning after the loss of the Essex, Captain Pollard ordered his men to cut away the sails and masts of the Essex, so it would right itself just enough to board her. In time, they entered the ship by cutting a hole through a portion of the hull that was still above water. This proved to be extremely beneficial, as they came away with 600 pounds of ship's biscuit, 135 gallons of water, 6 turtles, 1 musket, 2 pistols, tools, and 2 pounds of spare nails. For navigation, they retrieved 2 compasses, 2 quadrants, and 2 navigation manuals. The whaleboats tied up to the Essex using long lines, being not quite ready to depart on their long, improbable journey. The men attempted to sleep through the night, but many were gripped with anxiety. Some cried, some lied in silent misery. Only a lucky few managed to sleep at all. The following day, the men salvaged even more from the Essex by stripping her spars, smaller sails, rope, and some cedar planks. They fastened an additional mast and sail on each whaleboat, and used the cedar planks to raise the sides of the boats by 6 inches. With nothing left to salvage from the Essex, they departed on the afternoon of November 22nd, 2 days after the whale destroyed their ship. Sailing south, Pollard, Chase, and Joy each commanded a boat, with 7 in Pollard's and Joy's boat and 6 in Chase's boat. Calculating latitude was relatively easy, but they had no reliable method to know their longitude, and had to rely on dead reckoning. Daily rations per man were a measly half pint of water and 1 1/4 pounds of ship's biscuit. Leaks were a continuous problem which required non-stop care and maintenance. Boards were nailed over leaks, but bailing of water had to be performed almost constantly. Pollard's boat was nearly destroyed by a 12-foot fish, perhaps a shark or small whale. The men in the other 2 boats acted quickly, and came to Pollard's aid to successfully fend off the attack. Food became a growing concern, knowing the long voyage ahead and their limited rations. After 10 days of their voyage south, they slaughtered the first of their turtles to add to their rations. Occasional flying fish who had the misfortune of landing in one of the boats were devoured almost instantly. By December 8th, 16 days into their voyage, they had traveled 600 miles and reached 17 degrees south, but already hunger and thirst were taking their toll. The men were famished, weak, and showing signs of sickness. Under the tropical sun, faces were burned red and lips were cracked and swollen. Worst of all was the agony of their parched, dry throats. The hunger was constant, but the thirst tormented them. On December 14th, Chase calculated the distance remaining and made the bold decision to cut rations in half. This meant only half a ship's biscuit and 1/4 pint of water per day per man. He feared the men would panic and possibly try to steal rations, and so kept a pistol with him at all times. But there were no such attempts, and his men remained well disciplined. They finally reached 25 degrees south on December 20th, somehow making the first 1,900 miles south in a month. But Chase's calculations indicated they had very little chance of making it to Chile before dying of starvation or thirst. Yet there was no other option but to try. Later that same morning, a cry rang out from one of the men. "There is land!" Despite being weak and exhausted, every man popped up in disbelief. Peering into the distance, Owen Chase recalled, "It appeared at first a low white beach, and lay like a basking paradise before our longing eyes." For 4 hours the men struggled to guide their boats to their salvation in the distance. When they finally reached the sandy beach, the weary and delirious men mustered up the last bit of their strength, crawled out of their boats, and pulled themselves on shore. They could hardly believe to be on dry land after the inexplicable loss of the Essex and the torturous journey in the whaleboats. By some miracle, they happened to come across a tiny spit of land that they believed was Ducie Island. But they were mistaken. They had landed on what is known today as Henderson Island, an uncharted elevated coral atoll just 6 miles long by 3 miles wide. They had unknowingly been blown off course and were farther west than they realized. Part of the Pitcairn Island group, Henderson Island is 200 miles west-northwest of Ducie and 3,200 miles west of Chile. Although they didn't know it, Pitcairn Island itself was just 120 miles away, and had they landed there, they would have encountered the descendants of Fletcher Christian and the other bounty mutineers. The men immediately began to search for food and water, some so weak they could only crawl on their hands and knees. Although they were able to scavenge some berries, catch a few crabs, and capture birds that had absolutely no fear of humans, it was a meager amount. The island also had very little in the way of fresh water. What appeared to be salvation was turning out to be a mirage. Throughout the day and into the next, they desperately searched for a water source, hoping for a hidden gully, cistern, or rivulet. Finally, a joyous shout was heard. Fresh water had been found right there on the beach in a rocky outcropping. At low tide, fresh water bubbled up from underground and provided pure, fresh drinking water. The men drank their fill, finally satiating their parched throats, and then began filling their kegs. With some additional food and finally fresh water, the men had their first night of restful sleep in over a month. Even with the life-saving discovery of water, the island could not provide enough food to sustain them. On Christmas Day, their search for food was completely futile. That night, Pollard made the decision to leave the island as soon as their water kegs were filled and their boats repaired. Their plan was to sail east-southeast for Easter Island, a known location on their charts. The winds would be in their favor, and if they could stay on course, they should easily find it. They believed the journey would be 900 miles, as they thought they were on Ducie Island, but in fact it was 1,100 miles from Henderson Island. 3 men, William Wright, Seth Weeks, and the man who burned Floriana Island, Thomas Chappell, chose to stay on Henderson Island rather than face any more time in the whaleboats. Captain Pollard promised to send a rescue ship for them, if he had the opportunity to do so. Before departing, Pollard wrote an account of the sinking of the Essex, placed it in a metal box, and attached it to a tree. On the morning of December 27th, the 17 men boarded their 3 whaleboats and once again took their chances in the open sea. The 3 boats stayed together, as before, and set out for Easter Island, where its massive stone figures, the moai, loomed over its shores, and its native peoples were known to be friendly. For the first 7 days all went well, and Chase was able to easily track their latitude. However, their luck ran out on January 3, 1821, when a severe gale whipped across their path, slamming the whaleboats with harsh winds and crushing waves. The storm ravaged the boats for several hours, pushing the men to the brink of disaster. When the storm finally subsided, Chase determined they had been blown far off course to the south. Now with Easter Island to their northeast, unfavorable winds eliminated any chance of successfully landing there. Once confident they would reach Easter Island, they were now despondent. Their only hope was continuing east-southeast with the wind. Chase lamented, "We had but little hesitation in concluding, therefore, to steer for the islands of Juan Fernandez, which lay east-southeast from us, distant 2,500 miles. The archipelago was most famous for being the site of marooned sailor Alexander Selkirk from 1704 to 1709. Selkirk's story is believed to have inspired the 1719 novel Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. Despite the brief respite and small amount of food obtained from Henderson Island, the men were still extremely malnourished, weak, and showing symptoms of mental degradation. With their rations limited to a cup of water and 3 ounces of bread, starvation was a very real possibility. 3 days later, on January 10th, second mate Matthew Joy perished. He had been sickly even before leaving Nantucket, and his weakened state made him even more vulnerable to the privations of being stranded at sea. Matthew Joy was sewn up inside of his clothes and given a dignified burial at sea. Boat steerer Obed Hendricks took command of Joy's boat. 2 days later, the 3 boats were met with another squall. In the dark storm, Owen Chase did what he could to keep his boat from capsizing. He turned into the wind and held on as waves crashed over his boat. Through rain, mist, and spray, he soon realized he could not see the other 2 boats. Chase continued to search for hours, but to no avail. He and those with him on his boat were alone. With 1,700 miles and 5 weeks still to go, Chase reduced rations again. He and the 4 others with him were soon too weak to stand. It took a superhuman effort simply to manage the sails and rudder. When a shark attacked their tiny boat, they tried to harpoon the animal, hoping for a much-needed feast of shark flesh. But they were too weak to even pierce the shark's skin, and barely managed to just drive it away. On January 20th, Richard Peterson told Chase that he would voluntarily forego his rations, feeling his death was near. Chase described, "In a few minutes he became speechless. The breath appeared to be leaving his body, and at 4 o'clock he was gone." Like Matthew Joy, Peterson was given a proper mariner's burial. On the same day, but 100 miles north in Hendricks's boat, another man, Lawson Thomas, perished also. As their provisions had run out, the decision was made to eat his body. 2 days later, Charles Shorter died, followed in succession by Isaiah Shepard and Samuel Reed. The flesh of the men was removed, and what was not eaten immediately was stored for the future. By January 28th, 11 remained, 4 in Captain Pollard's boat, 3 in Hendricks's boat, and 4 with Chase. During the night of January 29th, Hendricks became separated from Pollard, drifting out of sight. Obed Hendricks, William Bond, and Joseph West were never seen again. Months later, a boat with 3 skeletons washed up on Ducie Island. Whether it was the 3 men from the Essex remains uncertain. On February 1st, what remained of the stored flesh was gone, and Captain Pollard made the decision to draw lots, according to the custom of the sea. He wrote of this, "We looked at each other with horrid thoughts in our minds, but we held our tongues. I am sure we loved one another as brothers all the time, yet our looks told plainly what must be done." Lots were drawn. Charles Ramsdell drew the lot of executioner. Cabin boy Owen Coffin was the unfortunate soul who drew the shortest. "I started forward and cried out," recounted Pollard. My lad, if you don't like your lot, I'll shoot the first man that touches you." The poor emaciated boy hesitated for a moment or two. Quietly laying his head down upon the gunwale of the boat, he said, "I like it as well as any other." He was soon dispatched, and nothing of him left. On the 11th of February, a Portuguese sailor named Barzile Rey succumbed to starvation, and he too was eaten by Pollard and Ramsdell. At about that same time, on Chase's boat, Isaac Cole went mad with delirium, asked for a napkin, and fell to the bottom of the boat in a fit. He died soon after, and his body was consumed by the 3 remaining men. "I have no language to paint the anguish of our souls in this dreadful dilemma," wrote Owen Chase. By February 18th, both Pollard and Chase were approximately 300 miles west of the Chilean coast, although separated by hundreds of miles. That morning, while Owen Chase was dozing, and cabin boy Thomas Nickerson was near death under a canvas, Benjamin Lawrence suddenly shouted, "There's a sail!" Chase, who could barely stand, struggled to his feet and peered over the side. As he described it, they were, quote, "in a state of abstraction and ecstasy upon the blessed vision of a vessel 7 miles off." It was the vessel Indian out of London. In desperation, and using what strength they could muster, they managed to reach the Indian. Far too weak to climb aboard, the 3 men had to be carried. 5 days later, Pollard and Ramsdell were also rescued by the Nantucket whaler Dauphine, 100 miles from the Chilean coast near St. Mary's Island. The 2 men had been delirious with starvation, fading in and out of consciousness while sucking on the bones of their fallen comrades. Owen Chase, Thomas Nickerson, and Benjamin Lawrence were taken first to Juan Fernandez Island, their intended destination, which was just a few miles from where they were rescued. The Indian then took them to Valparaiso, where they were placed on board the USS Constellation to recover under the care of the ship's surgeon. Pollard and Ramsdell were transferred to the Nantucket whaleship Two Brothers, and on March 17th, they were reunited with their 3 shipmates on board the USS Constellation. Chase, Nickerson, Lawrence, and Ramsdell departed Valparaiso for Nantucket aboard the whaleship Eagle on March 23rd. Captain Pollard was too weak to travel and remained on board the Constellation. He returned to Nantucket 2 months later in May, on board the vessel Two Brothers. The commander of the Constellation arranged for the rescue of the 3 men still stranded. Captain Pollard kept his promise and arranged with the commander of the Constellation for the rescue of the 3 men still stranded on Henderson Island. Still believing them to be on Ducie Island, the Constellation's commander asked the captain of the Australian merchant vessel Surrey to make a stop to rescue the men. Finding Ducie completely uninhabited, the captain wisely speculated that they had been mistaken about what island they were on, and he continued on to Henderson Island. Thomas Chappell, William Wright, and Seth Weeks were found alive and were rescued. They served as part of the crew on the Surrey for a time before returning to England and the United States, respectively. After the loss of their ship, the crew of the Essex sailed an unbelievable distance of 4,500 miles in open boats, battling storms and fending off starvation. Of the 21 men who set out on the Essex from Nantucket, 9 survived, including Henry DeWitt, who jumped ship in Atacama. Of the 12 who died, only 2 were buried at sea. 3 men disappeared, and 7 of the men were eaten, including Owen Coffin, who was killed specifically for this purpose. News of the Essex reached Nantucket prior to the arrival of the 5 survivors who reached Chile, and it was well known that the men had engaged in cannibalism. But Nantucketers understood the dangers of whaling and what men must do to survive. They were accepted back into the community, and each of them went on to captain his own ship. Unlike Captain Thomas Dudley and Edwin Stevens from the 1884 wreck of the Mignonette, none of the survivors from the Essex faced any criminal charges for their actions. Captain Pollard was given command of the Two Brothers and set out on another Pacific voyage in 1822, with fellow Essex survivor Thomas Nickerson joining him. Two Brothers itself was wrecked on French frigate Shoal near the Hawaiian Islands in 1823, and its crew were rescued the following day by the whaleship Martha. This was to be Pollard's last voyage on a whaleship, as he was deemed to be an unlucky captain. He served a brief stint on a merchant vessel before taking a job as a grocer. He later became a town constable, serving as a night watchman in Nantucket for 13 years. Every year on November 20th, the anniversary of the sinking of the Essex, Pollard remembered and honored his fallen comrades by quietly fasting at home. Pollard was married to his wife Mary for 50 years and died in 1870 at the age of 79. First mate Owen Chase spent an additional 2 decades whaling in the Pacific, eventually becoming master and part owner of the whale ship Charles Carroll. Chase was married 4 times, his second wife being the widow of Essex second mate Matthew Joy. Chase retired from whaling in 1840 and slowly drifted into insanity. He began hoarding food in the attic of his Nantucket home, most likely due to the traumatic experiences he endured at sea. He also suffered from headaches and nightmares and spent 8 years at the Quays Asylum, a facility for the, quote, intemperate, feeble, unemployed, and insane in Nantucket. He died in 1869 at age 71. Cabin boy Thomas Nickerson served on board whale ships for over 10 more years, before moving on to merchant vessels and captaining his own ship. He retired to Brooklyn, New York, where author Leon Lewis convinced him to write an account of his experiences on the Essex, which Nickerson did. He delivered his memoirs to Lewis for editing, but the manuscript was placed in a trunk and forgotten. Nickerson then returned to Nantucket with his wife Margaret, where he operated a boarding house. Thomas Nickerson died in 1883 at age 77. But his manuscript was eventually discovered in 1960, along with his account of the 1823 wreck of the Two Brothers. It took another 20 years to be authenticated, and was then donated to the Nantucket Historical Association. Finally, in 1984, The Loss of the Ship Essex, Sunk by a Whale, and the Ordeal of the Crew in Open Boats was published. Charles Ramsdell continued to work on whaling ships, including the vessel Thames in 1822, before becoming captain of the vessel Lydia out of Salem. He was married twice, had 6 children, and died in 1866. Benjamin Lawrence also continued whaling for the next 2 decades. He became part owner and master of the vessel Dromo out of Nantucket, going on 3 Atlantic voyages. In 1848, he became the keeper of the Quays Asylum, before returning to a quiet life of farming and fishing from his home in Sconset. He had 6 children with his wife Eliza, and died in 1879. Herman Melville's 1851 novel Moby Dick was clearly inspired by the story of the Essex. Melville claimed to have met Owen Chase's son while at sea, who gave him a copy of Chase's memoir, Narrative of the Most Extraordinary and Distressing Shipwreck of the Whaleship Essex of Nantucket, which was attacked and finally destroyed by a large spermaceti whale in the Pacific Ocean. Of this work, Melville stated, "The reading of this wondrous story upon the landless sea and close to the very latitude of the shipwreck had a surprising effect upon me. Today, the story of the whaleship Essex is remembered as one of the greatest whaling tragedies of all time." That's going to do it for this bonus episode, The Whaleship Essex. Thank you so much for listening. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano. Original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can find him at seansiegfried.com. If you're enjoying the podcast and would like to hear even more bonus episodes, please join the Officers Club on Patreon at patreon.com/shipwreckspod. For just $5 a month, you will get at least 2 bonus episodes every month, and all episodes are ad-free. That's patreon.com/shipwreckspod. Or if you'd like to support the podcast with a contribution of any amount, you may do so at buymeacoffee.com/shipwreckspod. Last but not least, be sure to rate and review the show in your podcast app. I would really appreciate it. Please join me again next time. But until then, don't forget to wear your life jackets.